Hi, everyone. Wow, you really can't see anyone up here. Okay, great. I'm Ali, and I run a company called Happy Bear Software. We're a Ruby on Rails development consultancy. And I'll warn you before this talk that I haven't actually been a professional developer for about 3, maybe 4 years. So all of my interaction with software development tends to happen indirectly through the wonderful team we have at Happy Bear instead of me actually writing the code myself. This talk I'm going to talk to you about today is about mental models for better code. It started originally with about 20 models, some ideas were for better code, but that talk was about 2 hours long, so I managed to whittle it down to 6 over the past few days. Now, I spend a lot of time, well, a considerable amount of time thinking about how to create an environment for developers that firstly gets the best out of them, but what I want eventually is a place where I can take a generally smart and kind human being and turn them, for better or worse, into a programmer that I can then bill out to our clients such that our clients are happy with the service, and also it isn't an entirely terrible job for that person to be doing. Still a work in progress on all fronts with that. And in order to do that, my thinking as to what taking a non-programmer and turning them into a programmer is like and what it's going to involve from us involves 3 sort of spheres of activity that I want them to focus on. Firstly, it's what you learn when you think about learning when you start learning to program, which is the mechanical ability to build software. It's using tools like Bash, Git, running Ruby code, watching it fail, debugging it, just the basic action of taking a problem and solving it with code. Secondly, is to develop technical depth. We want eventually the developers that work at our company to not be the people that are looking for answers on Stack Overflow, but the ones that are writing the answers on there instead. And finally, I think probably I wouldn't separate it and say it's the most important thing, but without it, none of the rest really matters. We need them to develop them communication skills, because that speaks directly to their ability to affect change at our clients and provide value for them, and for us to be a better, more collaborative team internally as well. And the idea is that we make them exercise all 3 of those things, their skill, their knowledge, and their communication ability, in a number of environments, in a number of situations, some battles that they can win, some battles that they can't, such that over time they develop this magical other quality that I term good judgment. The idea behind that is simply the ability to make decisions that lead to better outcomes. And we don't really have like a well-defined method for teaching that. All we're going to do is just round them up against these situations and hope that this good judgment develops later. But when we think about good judgment, and if we're calling it good decision-making, then anything that helps you make better decisions is something worth teaching, something worth talking about. And that's what I mean when I say a mental model. A mental model to me is any idea, practice, technique, quote, framework for thinking that helps you make better decisions. And this talk is about 6 of them, and there's one mental model that's kind of threaded through all of them that I'll speak about at the end as well, which I'd like you to take on board too. So let's begin with these models. A lot of companies have values, right? Values. A mission statement, a purpose, a list of ideas that makes that company what it is. I only started a company kind of like off the back of my own contracting. I didn't really have a plan or a vision or a mission statement or a list of values. But if you put a gun to my head and you said, Ali, you have to choose one thing, one consistent thing that's threaded through everything you do, I would pick this value, this idea. It's mistakenly commonly known as Sturgeon's Law. It's actually called Sturgeon's Revelation if you look it up on the Wikipedia page, which I did before this talk. And it goes something like this. 90% of everything is crap. 90% of estate agents are crap, you know this. 90% of recruiters are crap. 90% of code bases are crap, and 90% of development consultancies are probably crap too. And that may sound very negative compared to the types of value statements that you're used to, but for me it's incredibly liberating, right? Because if I assume, because I was an okay programmer when I started this agency. I was all right, I wasn't brilliant. But I went from being an okay programmer to being terrible at about 18 other jobs, like being in sales or being in management and taking care of developers and trying to teach them as well. So I didn't have any illusions about how good I would be at those things. I knew I'd be terrible. And every decision I've made about how Happy Bear software works comes from looking at how other companies I worked at before were terrible and then just doing the opposite thing, right? And it's been extremely successful. That's been a very good strategy for doing it, and that's why I've mentioned it here. We're calling it the principle of inversion here, which is that instead of that big, shiny idea, instead of that really amazing thing you want to do, that solution you want to move towards, think about what you don't want and do the opposite of that thing. And how this works on a code base is instead of thinking about the massive refactor you want to do, all of that technical debt that you want to fix, try and think of what's one small thing today that you can do today that makes your code base slightly less terrible than it was yesterday, right? That means running Brakeman and maybe fixing some of the errors it throws, running Rubocop on a part of the code base that you're not running it on at the moment, writing a test, improving your documentation, something very small that improves your code today. And the context that this is a good model to use is when you have a code base that you care about the quality of, which isn't always the case. If you have something that's a prototype that you tend to throw away, you may not find this to be particularly useful. Or perhaps maybe, not so much now, but perhaps decades ago in the games industry, once you'd release a game onto this a physical thing called a CD-ROM that we used to have back then, and you burn it onto it and sell it to people, you can't then fix that code, so you don't care as much about, in that situation, the quality of that code. And the prediction I'm going to make is that if you do this, if you make a small incremental improvement to your code base, some movement away from being terrible, or movement away from being in the 90% of all things that are crap, then you, over the course of a year, 3 years, 5 years, you will have an order of magnitude easier to work with code base than you do now, or that you would have otherwise, okay? The next idea, outside-in testing. Because onions have layers, like software has layers. Right? So outside-in testing, if you're not familiar with this idea, it's the idea that, and I'm not super dogmatic about testing, but this particular model is very useful, I think. And it's the idea that for any application you have where you have some kind of user-facing component, and you've been given the task of creating a feature in that application or modifying a feature, the first thing you do is write a test that exercises the application, or exercises the application as a user would, right? So you write a test using probably on a Rails app, Capybara, RSpec, or some combination of the above, and it sort of fills out forms, presses buttons, and expects some data to have been modified, right? And that's the first thing you do, and you watch that test fail. The next thing you do is write a test somewhere further into the stack. So perhaps around a root, or perhaps around your view, around your controller, and then all the way down to your model. And in each stage of that process, you're watching the tests fail without necessarily fixing them. And then you pass the tests backwards up through the stack, starting from your model, going through your controller and your view and other places. And one of the nice side effects of this way of working is that you get tests around all of the code that you write, which is nice. The context that this applies well in, I believe, is when you have a situation where there's a user-facing component to your software, though you could make the argument that you could actually make work in this way for software that only other software interacts with. But I think the most natural place for it is when you have an actual human user clicking things. And the prediction I'm going to make about this model is that if you use it, especially if you're a new developer, especially if you're kind of new to the industry and you have less confidence, that this will give you a good set of guide rails. Because one question you might have when you're starting, and this is one of the reasons why this is one of the only models we teach to newer developers, if we find the need to, is that it's difficult to know where to start when you have a big complex feature to work on. And so every one of those options, starting at the model, starting at the view, starting at the controller, starting with the tests, every one of those is an opportunity to go down very, very deep rabbit holes, which you don't know, and you don't know when to stop when you go down there, especially if you don't have experience. So what this way of working does is it encourages you to avoid those rabbit holes and then just focus on what you require to get those tests passing and to have to get the feature implemented. Okay? Next one. code reviews. Code reviews are one of my favorite techniques in a team, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. If you're not familiar with the idea of code reviews, first of all, that's okay, that's for you. You should be at this point. Code reviews are basically when you're working on a particular bit of code that you haven't yet merged into master, or you haven't yet pushed up to production, and you decide that you need feedback on this, or you would like to get feedback on this code from somebody else in the team. Someone else then give you some feedback, and then the idea is that you then work collaboratively on that code and to get it to a point where you're both comfortable putting it up to production. Okay? And the context in which this idea of code reviews works well, and is any time you're working in a team, I think, on software, right, and you're using version control as well. The predictions I'm going to make about this are threefold. Right? So first of all is the obvious prediction. Right? Is that when you have some code and you have someone else look at it, firstly there's a separation between the act of building a feature such to meet such a certain set of requirements, and then someone else looking at that after the fact, not having all the context that you had. Right? It's kind of analogous to drafting a bit of writing and having someone edit it afterwards. Because you'll be very content with the idea that you've finished what the requirements are, but then someone else coming in with a fresh pair of eyes will be able to say, okay, well, what's the security situation with this code? What is the performance situation? What things can we do to improve this that are kind of non-functional requirements that you may not have been focusing on while we're working on it? And that is kind of the obvious good outcome from this. But there are two more that I kind of feel, as someone who runs an organization, that I think are a great deal more important. The second prediction I'm going to make about code reviews is that if you truly, when you interact in code reviews, you truly believe in behave in a collaborative way, and are generous with your comments, and you take the kind of opportunity to teach each other, then it can be an extremely good way to transfer knowledge within your organization. And that's not just technical knowledge. That's not just the details of how to write Ruby code or how to implement a feature in Rails. It's also domain-specific information about how your team works and the problems you have. And for any company, that's an extremely valuable thing to have spread around your team. But that isn't, in my opinion, the best part about code reviews. The third prediction I'm going to make about code reviews is this. When you participate in that manner, when you treat each other with like a bit of generosity, and you take time to explain things to each other, and you show examples of what you mean, what you're doing there is you are sort of establishing and enriching the professional relationships on your team, right? And if you do that consistently, if you treat each other that way very often on a long-term basis, then you're going to have a much better, more productive, and more tight-knit team than you would have otherwise. The code, and this will reflect itself in the code, which is one of the later models that we talk about as well. Okay. This one you won't have heard of. And I added this one partly because anytime you add Japanese to a talk, it sounds much more profound, right? Like than it needs to be. I would just go put anything up there in Japanese. And I wanted to have a translation, but a couple of nights ago, Matt asked me, Ali, how do you translate this word nemawashi into English? And we spoke about it for a while, and for I think what are obvious reasons, once I get to the explanation, we don't have a word for this in English. I'll first tell you what nemawashi isn't. Nemawashi is not when you are in an organization, and let's say on a development team, and you want to implement a very big change, right? Like a change that you have experience with, and that you know will solve a number of problems for this team, right? It could be anything that you've used before that you'd like to implement in this new organization. And you go into a meeting, very confident, and you tell everyone that this is a thing that we could do. It would solve XYZ problem. And I've been this developer multiple times in my career, and I've always left that meeting with no one having any interest in implementing the idea that I've just suggested. Even when you have authority on that team, when you pay their salaries, you can go into a Slack channel with them and say, hey guys, I want to try this thing, and they can all pile on and tell you that it's a terrible idea pretty much straight away. I have experience with that one. Nemawashi is the opposite of that, right? It is instead of announcing your idea to a team publicly, the first way you do it, and having like a brainstorming session where everyone piles on and tells you how terrible it is, You go to just one person in that room, one person whose life that change is going to affect. You take 5 or 10 minutes of their time, and you listen to their concerns. You talk about the problem. You talk about what you'd like to do to solve it. And whatever concerns they have, you then write down on a piece of paper somewhere, and you say, okay, well, I'll try and come up with ways to mitigate that, and I'll think about this, and I'll get back to you. Thank you for your time. And then you do that with the second person. And then you iterate on your proposal. You think about what they want from this as well, like what concerns they have, and you put that as part of your proposal too. And then you keep going around your room and around that room of people before you get to that meeting, such that when you get to that meeting, everyone, whether or not they 100% agree with you, feels like that they've been heard. And as Andy said yesterday, we're all a bunch of toddlers, and believe me, if you've got a toddler, when they want to be heard, they're going to be heard. When you work in this way, the context in which this is a good idea is anytime you want to implement a change on a big team, and you need to get buy-in from a large number of people. And the prediction I'm going to make is that if you're much more likely to get closer to that buy-in when you use this technique than otherwise. And as I mentioned, like I said, we don't have a word for this in English, but my wife, who's Japanese, informs me that this is joshiki, which means common sense in Japanese, but not in English, apparently. Okay, 2 more, we're nearly done. This one is not one that I came up with myself. A couple of years ago at a conference about Ruby in a town that also begins with B, I saw a talk by a lady called Sarah May. It was about models for describing development teams. And it was a very dense talk. Sarah is extremely clever, and she's very good at sort of distilling her knowledge and experience in ways that make them sort of understandable and approachable for people like me. And she went through a lot of different mental models and ideas in that talk. It was very, very dense, so I had to watch it a couple of times. But while I was sitting there, I got to about 15 minutes in, and I had to think about this particular one that she kind of threw out there partway through the talk. And I believe she was quoting, as my friend told me a couple of days ago, a Conway's Law, which is something like the organizational structure that you have, the team, where your teams are split up, ends up being mirrored in the code that you write. Right? So if you have 3 teams, then the code tends to separate itself along those lines and what those teams are responsible for. But the example she gave didn't seem to be about that law, though. It was a slightly adjacent one instead. The example that Sarah gave in the talk was about like this grumpy developer who thinks themselves a genius, who is very standoffish with the rest of the development team, and just doesn't interact with them, doesn't have a healthy, functional relationship with them in the organization. And that when you look at the code, you'll see that it's kind of the same, right? There's a mapping. The code just does its own thing. It's in a different style from how everybody else works and doesn't interact with the code written by the other people in the organization. And that led me to think a little bit further about the inferences that might be making. Because I believe the arrow of causality goes from the relationship to the code, not the other way around. I don't think if you suddenly start, refactoring the code, the people would be nicer to each other, right? But the other way around, well, they might on some code bases. The other way around makes a lot more sense to me. And I feel like that's a prediction that could be true. So the idea here is that if you can improve the professional relationships on your team, that will make your code better, right? And that is something that I strongly believe to be a good predictor, right? Is if you can have a team that is more collaborative, that has more interest in each other's professional success, then the code you write is going to be better too. The context this applies in is any situation where you you're building software together as a team. And the prediction I'm going to make is, like I said, that if you improve those relationships, if you take time to show that you're actually trying to help each other solve the same problems, then that is as important as refactoring code, as fixing security vulnerabilities. That professional environment being created is just as important as those technical things as well. Okay? On to the last one, and this one I've been using for the entire talk. If you want me to give you advice about anything, it has to be one of 2 situations. In one way I might give you advice is if you ask me and I care about you, and the other way I give you advice is if you ask me and there is an email address to which I can send an invoice. And those are the only 2 ways I'm ever going to give you advice. And when I give you advice, I want you to use that advice in both cases, right? preferably both at the same time. That would be nice, but I want you to use that advice. And to make sure you use that advice, I use this little mini framework for talking about advice. First, I try to think about and understand the context that you're in and how that advice might apply to it. And then I try and make a prediction that could be wrong about using that advice, about material reality. And I'll give you an example here of something I saw recently that wasn't this, right? So when you're giving each other advice, for example, in a pull request, a hypothetical, let's call it a hypothetical example. So it was a comment on a pull request, and it said something along the lines of, this code, a simple one line with a full stop. This code is a violation of solid principles. Full stop. Now, that developer didn't work at Happy Bear Software, for example, in this hypothetical situation. But if they did, that would be an egregious failure in my communication of our expectations of what we want you to do in the job. And what I would tell that person, if I don't already have a wiki page about it, which I should write, what I would tell that person is that next time they give advice to someone, could they first try and be a bit more specific than that, but also tell us why that principle, that practice, that whatever that thing is that you're trying, that thing that you're trying to sort of make us do here, why is that relevant to this context, right? What context did that exist in, and then what was it written for, and why is that the same as the context we're in now? And then make a prediction, right? Say, if you do the thing I'm telling you to do, this good thing is going to happen. Or the other way around, if you don't do this thing that I'm telling you to do, then this bad thing is going to happen, okay? And the context of this is anytime you're giving somebody else feedback. And the prediction I'm going to make is that if you use this structure, then you're much more likely to get them to, firstly, take your advice, and secondly, to actually act on it and do the thing that you want them to do. Okay? I've managed to finish relatively early there. So those are my 6 mental models that I think would be useful. Inversion, outside-in testing, code reviews, nemawashi, relationships and code and the mapping between them, context and prediction. As mentioned, for the few of you who know me, I am indeed leaving the country in July, so it would be very nice to catch up with you before then. Thank you very much. That's all. I hope that was useful.